Alright, so for today's video, I want to talk a little bit more about aspect ratios, a handful of movies that are in different aspect ratios, and talk a little bit more about IMAX, because I really didn't cover IMAX in my last video. But before I do, I just want to say a sincere thank you to anybody who watched my videos, left a comment, left a like, subscribed. The comment section brought a lot of different perspectives that I really appreciate. And whether or not you were convinced to go watch a movie in full screen on a DVD, I still appreciate the feedback and the insight a lot of you provided into that. And my original idea for this video was to take a deeper look at that. However, when I was doing my research, I came across this video from a YouTube channel called From the Frame. It covers almost everything I was planning on covering. So rather than rehash all that, they did a fantastic job. Go watch their video. I wouldn't even be offended if you stopped watching my video now and went and watched this, because it does a fantastic job explaining it. I'm just going to provide a little bit of context from my time as a projectionist in a movie theater and a little bit of my opinion mixed in. And again, that YouTube channel is From the Frame, and I link the video below. Now let's talk a little bit more about aspect ratios, and specifically movies that are presented in the scope or flat formats. With a flat movie being in the 1.85 to 1 aspect ratio, and when projected on the screen, the image mostly matches what was on the film, with maybe a little cropping at the top and bottom. However, if a movie is in the scope format, that image is in the 2.39 to 1 aspect ratio, and that image is squeezed onto the 35mm film, and then unsqueezed when projected onto a screen. And from my experience as a projectionist, there are two ways that an image can be unsqueezed. The first way to accomplish this is to project the image using a lens that essentially stretches the image, making the image much wider than it was in the frame, but looking normal when it's on screen. And at the theater I worked at, we had auditoriums that were set up kind of like this, where the screen was a 2.4 to 1 screen with curtains on either side. So when you're watching the previews, if they're in the 16:9 format, it would look like this. And right before the movie would come on, this would happen. The curtains would open up, revealing even more of the screen, and now it's in the 2.39 to 1 aspect ratio, and your entire field of view is pretty much consumed by the movie you are going to watch. It's a really cool moment, and it really helps you get immersed in the movie you're about to watch. However, there's another way that some theaters do it, and we had a few auditoriums that wouldn't stretch the image. Instead, when it went through the lens squished the image. And again, it's in that same 2.39 to 1 aspect ratio, only instead of stretching the sides, it compressed the top and bottom. And when you are in an auditorium that is a little bit more narrow, instead of the curtains being on the side, the curtain is actually at the top. So again, you'd be sitting in this movie theater, the previews would begin to play, but right before the movie would start, that curtain would come down and the movie would begin to play. And you really lose that moment of immersion I described before, because the screen doesn't get wider, filling your field of view. It actually gets smaller, reducing your field of view. And let's just say I avoided watching anything at a 2.39 to 1 aspect ratio in auditoriums that did this. I want to jump back to the theater where the curtains would open up and the screen would get wider. In these auditoriums, if a movie in the flat format or the 1.85 to 1 aspect ratio was shown in this theater, those curtains just stayed where they are. In that case, you also didn't get that moment of the screen opening up and your field of view being more consumed by the movie. I say all this because if you're the type of person who wants to go to the movie theater and see a certain movie on the biggest screen possible, just because a movie is in a wider aspect ratio doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be on the widest screen the theater has. It could be in an auditorium that has a 16:9 screen where they cover part of it with a curtain and project the 2.39 to 1 movie on that screen. And the best way to find out is simply just to call your local theater before you go, or look online to see the size and shape of the auditorium it's in. Speaking of seeing movies on the biggest screen possible, let's talk about IMAX. So first, let's talk about movies that are filmed for IMAX. I took this right off of the IMAX website, IMAX.com, and they highlight 3 things that when a movie is filmed for IMAX must happen. In pre-production, they need to choose IMAX film or an IMAX certified digital camera. During production, they need to at least film part of the movie in the 1.9 or the 1.43 aspect ratio. And finally, afterwards, the IMAX team must collaborate with the filmmakers to ensure that the movies are optimized for IMAX properly. And I say that because there's a handful of movies, 2 examples are The Running Man and Wicked for Good, that advertise they're going to be in IMAX. You'll see things like Experience It in IMAX. But these movies were not filmed for IMAX, at least according to the website. These movies are going to be presented in their 2.39 to 1 aspect ratio on the IMAX screen. From an aspect ratio perspective, it's the same movie you're going to see if you go see it in any other theater. Now, there are other differences between a standard theater and an IMAX theater, but for the purpose of this video, I'm just going to talk about the aspect ratio. So if you're interested in that, I would direct you to the IMAX website, which is also linked below. Now let's talk about two movies that were filmed for IMAX, The Fantastic Four: The First Steps and Superman. Superman was shot in the 1.9:1 aspect ratio, which again is one of the aspect ratios used when it's filmed for IMAX. But when they released in theaters, they still showed it in a 1.85:1 aspect ratio. So they only adjusted the image a little bit to get it to fit into most theaters. And once it was released digitally and on HBO Max and physical media, it would just about fill an entire 16:9 TV without much need for cropping or matting. Fantastic Four, however, took a different approach. They filmed specific scenes in the 1.43:1 aspect ratio, with the rest of the movie being shot in the 1.9:1 aspect ratio for IMAX. However, when they wanted to put this movie into standard theaters, instead of doing what Superman did and giving it a 1.85:1 release, they decided to matte the image a bit more for a 2.39:1 aspect ratio. The good news is the movie is now on Disney Plus, and both versions of the movie are there. You can watch it in the standard 2.39:1 aspect ratio, or you can watch it in what they call IMAX Enhanced, which will fill your entire 16:9 television. It also allows me to compare the two, so here you go. So what I did was I put the theatrical release on top of the IMAX Enhanced version, and those black bars you see on your screen show you what you are missing if you're watching the theatrical release. Now, in some cases, I actually had to zoom in on the theatrical release in order to get everything matched up properly. So in some scenes, you'll see that number jump to 105%. That just means I had to zoom in just a little bit on the image to get it to match as best I could. At least between the IMAX Enhanced version and the theatrical release, while you're not missing a lot of the image, it's still curious as to why they did this to begin with. Why wouldn't they just show this movie in a 1.85:1 aspect ratio in theaters? My guess is they wanted to be consistent with the other Marvel movies, and that's why they did this. Although I know the Avengers and Ant-Man were both in a 1.85:1 aspect ratio. Or maybe they just really like the 2.39:1 version of the movie, and that's why they released it in theaters. Either way, I do think they did a good job framing this movie that no matter what aspect ratio you watched it in, you will still have a good time with the movie. And that brings us to the end. Thank you for watching. If you like these type of videos, let me know. Leave a like, leave a comment. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day.